The last few weeks, I've been speaking on some core essentials. Why? Because we often take for granted that maybe people coming in know certain things, and maybe people who have been they've been believers, followers of Yeshua for some time, but maybe they learned something badly. Maybe they weren't discipled in a certain way. We have a few people here, when they first came, I sat with them, and they would explain certain things on why they wanted to come to a Messianic congregation, and I had to disciple them because they had been taught badly. And how do you know if something's just bad teaching? Well, you look at the fruit that it produces in your life. If it produces just a kind of grim religiosity, and you're not getting free, you need to question what you're doing. Because you could be having a lot of pomp and a lot of showcasing, and the devil's a showman. He likes attention. And this is why often Yeshua would go into religious spaces, and demons would start getting cast out. The first place that Yeshua started casting demons was in the faith community. It wasn't among the law. It was among his own. And so I want to speak to you today, as we've been talking about you being shepherded, being planted, being rooted last week. Today I want to speak about being grafted. And I'd like you to turn to Romans chapter 11, and you're going to see why this metaphor that Paul uses of the olive tree, yes, it has to do with Israel, first of all, because as I've been going through these last few messages, throughout the Brit Hadashah, throughout the New Testament, Israel is the primary example God uses to reveal how he deals with those who trust from him, with those who trust in him through Yeshua, Israel's Messiah and representative. So the story of Israel becomes a model for understanding discipleship in Messiah. There is as much of the gospel of Yeshua the Messiah, there's as much of the good news in Israel's story as we often perceive of bad news in Israel's story, and how we couldn't keep the law, and how Israel's failings in the wilderness, and usually when I'm speaking at different churches and helping them understand the Israel piece, usually I'm telling them, listen, you see the critiques of Israel in our own scriptures, but no other nation would have done any better. No other nation would have done any better. Oh, they're stiff-necked. Well, good news, you are too. Okay? And so the story of Israel becomes a model for understanding discipleship in Messiah. And if you're in Romans chapter 11, listen, Romans chapter 9 through 11 is the spine of the book of Romans. It's the spine. It is the core. And Romans 9 through 11 is all about God's purpose, plans, and dealings with the people of Israel, with the Jewish people. All right? And I've been in many types of different denominational settings where I've heard pastors or the teachers going through Romans, and they will skip over Romans 9 through 11 because they don't know what to do with it. Some of them don't. And it's just because, that's why you have to be taught the word. You have to be taught the full counsel of the word. I was talking with a buddy of mine last night. He's Jewish. He's a pastor in Texas. And, he said he had to do a message on one of the Psalms, and there was a lot about sin, and he submitted it to the senior pastor, and he said, look, I can't avoid this. I have to talk about this. It's not going to be easy. And so the senior pastor, who's my mentor, Greg Stone, he's also Jewish from New Jersey, and he said, well, you got to go there. We got to go there. We can't omit the challenging, hard things that Scripture discusses. You can't ignore the hard, challenging things. And when you hear me speaking, in a challenging way, it's because that causes growth as much as those good things. All right? Because ultimately, God's goodness is even in those challenges as well. All right? So Romans 9 through 11 is, Paul's great discourse about Israel. And you could go to verse 16. I'll read it here shortly. And what I want to speak to you today about is God's redemptive placement, not replacement, in Israel's redemptive covenant story. And so you're some of you who are Jewish, you're Jewish, but you know those who are not Jewish, they have been grafted in. They've been grafted in. And what we see is that faith in Israel's Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, connects you to Israel's root system, not an independent spiritual system. All right? Now, hear what I'm saying and what I'm not. I'm not saying that the way things are done in our modern time is necessarily independent just because time has progressed, changes have been made, there have been adaptations in Judaism and in Christianity. And of course, we know that Yeshua did not come to establish another religion. You know, we don't need more religion. He didn't come to just show us how to do something. He showed us who to worship and the fullness of who God is. That was part of Moses' prayer. So it connects you to Israel's root system, not an independent spiritual system. That doesn't mean we throw away the rest of the church. Okay? Different people do different things in different places. It's called culture. It's called context. So different people will do different things differently. I'm sure that I know many of you eat very differently from the way that we do. Okay? They're going to go in your house. You're not eating correctly. You know, no, I don't have time to police people like that. All right? Your discipleship and your growth is alongside what God is doing with Israel and the Jewish people, not independent from them. All right? Israel's growth is sustained by God's faithfulness to his covenant. And we know that in terms of Yeshua, they don't recognize Yeshua as their Messiah. And they are currently, the Jewish people are currently, you know, all the anti-Semitic rhetoric that's out there in the, you know, atmosphere right now, even in our nation, even among, you know, some far right-wing conservatives, what they don't understand in trying to look at Israel and Israel's flaws is it's not so much that Israel has those flaws because everybody else does too, as I just said, but it's that Israel is and the Jewish people are in an injured state. All right? They're in an injured state. What do I mean by that? Well, okay, Romans 9 through 11 is Paul's great discourse on Israel. Now, if you read the book of Romans, if you read any given commentary that's a classical Christian commentary on Romans, many assume that the primary subject in the book of Romans is God's grace. But grace is not the subject in the book of Romans because the spine of Romans is Romans 9 through 11, which is all about God dealing with Israel and the Jewish people. Grace is the method by which God is dealing with his people, the people of Israel. And because that's his method for dealing with Israel, that's also his method for dealing with non-Jewish people as well. That's also his method for dealing with Gentiles who accept Jesus the Messiah. All right? So Israel's the subject, the grace is the message because he's illustrating to the Roman Gentiles the grace by which God deals with Israel. And what we see here, Romans 9 through 11, is that Israel's apparent failure to recognize Yeshua as the Messiah opened the door for God's grace to reach the Gentiles. And what we see is that when Israel is restored, it will mean greater grace for the Gentiles and the nation, for the Gentile nations. Okay? So what does this tell us right off the bat? Well, for one, Yeshua's life is authoritative for all believers. We follow his example. Secondly, Israel's history is authoritative for all believers. That means Israel's story is important for you as a Gentile. For you as a Jew, that's a given. Okay? Grace comes by no other than Israel's Messiah, Yeshua. And without Israel, the nations are in complete darkness. That's why I say Israel's history is authoritative for all followers of Yeshua. Why? Because Yeshua's life itself mirrors Israel's history. He goes into the wilderness for how long? 40 days. Why 40 days? 40 days for every year Israel was in the wilderness. And he prevailed in the wilderness. He was able to guard himself from temptation and not fall into temptation in that time of fasting and need where Israel didn't prevail those 40 years. And so I could go all throughout the life of Yeshua, his life mirrors the story of Israel. So in that sense, he embodies Israel as a one-man Israel. He's like a one-man Israel. And he fulfills the calling that the entire nation of Israel was given. That was to do what? To be a light to the nations. There's no other Jewish person in history who's impacted the world the way Yeshua has. Maybe Moses, maybe Paul gets close. There's no other Jew who has done it like he has. So he's prevailed where Israel's failed and where Israel disobeyed. So Israel's history was significant in the life of Yeshua. So what does that mean for those who are Jewish people? Well, it means your identity as a Jew is still important. What does it mean for those who are Gentiles? It means that Israel's history is important. So you don't fall into the same traps, and yet you still have an example of those within Israel who remain faithful to God. People like Moses, Elijah, David. You know, why do you see all these videos online, AI-made videos, and people, like, doing like selfies of Moses parting the Red Sea. You know, he's there at the AI at the Red Sea and all that kind of stuff. You know, all of this, it's Israel's story that's impacted the nations. You go to any given traditional Greek, Orthodox, or Catholic church, and all those stained glass windows and all the murals and all the icons are of Jewish people. Huh? So how could God be done with Israel? All right? The entire unity and the prophetic nature of Yeshua being one with Israel, one with his people, as a concept forms brackets to everything in the book of Romans. In fact, in Romans 1 verse 2, Paul starts off in such a Jewish way. And he refers to the Nevi'im, the portion of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that's the prophets. Well, he ends in Romans 16. I wasn't going to get into this, but you put me on the spot. He ends Romans 16 in chapter 16, verse 26, and he says, this is now manifested by the scriptures of the prophets. So everything about Israel's prophetic tradition is framing the book of Romans. How is it not Jewish? How is it something that Martin Luther just kind of came into this, amazing revelation of? It already existed. There were Jews who had a hold of it. Peter, Paul. Martin Luther didn't figure anything out new. He just re-emphasized what the church lost, what they forgot. Why? Because the just shall live by faith. Hello, that's in the Tanakh. That's in the Old Testament, okay? So what does that mean for you? Well, for one, you're sustained by the root of Israel's Messiah. Let's read Romans 11:16 through 24. Start in verse 15 because he's talking about Israel's rejection. He says, if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So he's saying there's going to be literal resurrection when Israel gets a hold of who their Messiah is. All right? Verse 16, he says, if the first fruit is holy. If the first fruit is holy. Who's the first fruit? Well, that's Yeshua. He's the first fruits from the dead. He was raised on Bikurim. The lump is also holy. The lump is what? It's the lump of dough. Who's that is leaven? Well, humanity's leaven. The lump of dough is holy. That's Israel. If the root is holy, who's the root? Well, Revelation 5:5, Isaiah 11:1, Yeshua is the root of Jesse. He's the root of David. If the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree," he's speaking to the Gentiles here, "a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree." What's the fatness? That's the nutrients through the tree. The oil, the anointing. "Do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, remember you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say, then branches were broken off that I might be grafted in." And he's telling them, listen, if you boast, remember you don't support the root, but the root supports you. In other words, get some humility here. You didn't save yourself. And then he says that if they don't remember that, there's a pattern of a trajectory of thought. They might then say, well, okay, you know what? I am supported by the root, but they might then say, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said, because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be prideful, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fail severity, but towards you goodness. If you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. I'm going to get a little technical this morning into the Greek, but I'm going to help you understand, okay? You also will be cut off, and they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you, and everybody who's Jewish who's here, you're back on, you're back connected to the life again in a way that you weren't before. God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, listen to this very carefully. Many people don't really read this to where they get it. If you were, and he's speaking to Gentiles here, the Gentiles who had pride in the Roman Kehilat, the Roman community. He says, if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted against nature or contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? All right, so he's saying, you're sustained by the root of Israel's Messiah. You're sustained by the story of God with Israel. And Israel's a model for how he deals with his people. Yeshua is the model for how to fulfill the call of God and walk with him. And God's mercy to all the nations through Israel's Messiah and their partial blindness not to see him meant good news for the nations. All right? Now, let me share with you something that is odd about this illustration. All right? Because it's almost, it's like a parable. Here's what's odd. I really spent time studying agricultural practices and stuff like that. What's odd about this illustration of the olive tree is that the normal agricultural practice wouldn't be to graft a wild olive branch onto a cultivated olive branch, but it should be the other way around. Jay's up there like Mr. Green Thumb. You need to paint that thing green. Yeah. Just for when I'm doing messages, yeah. Okay, it's the other way around. The normal and the reason why Yeshua, you have the parables, is everything about the parables, there's always a shocking element that gets people's attention. And so if you knew agricultural practice, you would be reading Paul, you say, wait a second, that's not normal. That's not how you do it. The normal way is to take a cultivated branch, cut it off, and graft it onto a wild branch. Why? Well, because wild olive trees are valued because they're more disease resistant, they grow more vigorously, and they survive harsh conditions better. Their fruit, however, is small and it's poor in quality. So if you wanted better, bigger olives, you would graft a cultivated branch onto a wild olive tree. Okay? From a farming perspective, grafting a wild branch onto a cultivated tree would be unusual because wild branches normally produce inferior fruit, smaller olives. Secondly, they don't improve the cultivated tree at all. Lastly, they benefit from the cultivated root, not vice versa. So the only practical reason would be that the cultivated tree's root system can transform the productivity of the wild tree branch. And yet you have many in our society and very anti-Semitic things that sometimes are said throughout the rest of the church, and we don't, we love our brothers, pray for them to get the full understanding of Israel, not just, be like people in our society where you just cancel everybody, just cut everybody off. And I've had hard discussions with some of my pastoral friends. I've had hard discussions where I've had to sit down and they start asking me questions. I say, I need to walk you through where your line of thinking actually goes back to an anti-Semitic myth that was started in the medieval period. Or I need to go and walk you through certain things and walk them through to help them understand that you're not being, you're supported by the root, but why are you boasting against the branches? And so the wild branch receives nourishment from a superior root because it's grafted onto a superior tree. All right? The cultivated tree's root system transforms the productivity of the wild branch. What am I saying? I would like to be on like the Sean Ryan or Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens going through this with them. I better keep my mouth shut from my lips to God's ears. Okay, the wild branch receives nourishment from a superior root. I don't know how else to say this, and I don't want it to sound prideful in a carnal way. But Gentiles didn't improve Israel's covenant. Israel's covenant improves the nations and the Gentile nations. Hello? Where do you think Western civilization came from? You have this whole phrase, Judeo-Christian values. You'd have in U.S. courts, before they removed them, the tablets of what? The Ten Commandments. Where, you had the innovations of early scientists like Isaac Newton, Galileo, whose lives were influenced by things in the Word of God. And science used to be God-centered instead of man-centered. Okay, all of these ideas come from the scriptures that the Jewish people wrote. All right? And verse 24 says this. I just read it and emphasized it, that you know what? You were grafted contrary against nature into a cultivated olive tree. And so he's saying right there, this is not the normal practice agriculturally, in the natural, okay? Let me give you an illustration here, because followers of Messiah, planted in Messiah, grafted in alongside Israel, but are not Israel, because you take on Yeshua's identity, not the Jewish people's identity, okay? That would be called replacement theology, that the church replaces Israel. That's why I said I want to talk about God's placement, redemptive placement, not his replacement within Israel's covenant story. But you are included in the salvific activity, the delivering activity of the God of Israel. Why? Because he's a deliverer. He delivers. Let me give you this illustration. Imagine a large family, and they have an estate that's existed for generations. The parents built the house, established the traditions, and raised their children. Over time, they adopt another child and welcome that child fully into the family. That child now lives in the house, eats at the same table, shares in the family inheritance, gets the legal documents that show that their name has been changed because they have now become a part of the family. But the adopted child does not start a new separate house inside the same house they've been adopted into. But that's what many times in church history, what has happened. Okay? The adopted child doesn't start a new separate house inside the same house with their own rules and history. Instead, they grow within the existing family story. They learn the culture of the house. They honor the parents. They live alongside the other siblings. Even if you have one of the original children who may be rebellious and estranged, and they might take a section of the house to themselves and say, this is off limits, I'm going to do my own thing. And that is what the rabbis did. It wasn't just the church. The rabbis did the same thing with Yavne and Yehuda Anasi and after the destruction of the temple. You know, you don't have Sadducees anymore. You have the descendants of the Pharisees. The Pharisees weren't all bad guys. But you have this replacement of the temple by certain things that the rabbis had to institute, just the way the early church fathers instituted certain things. So it went both ways. It's not just one side is totally guilty. You following what I'm saying? If I had like hours to get into all the history, I could do it. And you'll get some of this in the Passover teachings that are going to be released in the next few weeks. All right? But let's say that if you have one of the original children in the family is currently wounded or estranged, take in their room, establish their own set of rules for how they're going to live and relate to the family. They're still a part of the family, even though they're rebellious, even though they're estranged. They're still part of the family, and the parents still remain committed to them. I remember people when I was. There's no other word to put it, but people would tell my mom and my dad, they would say, "You need to kick him out of the house." And my mother said, "Should I just kill my firstborn and send my firstborn out to the wolves? He might be the way he is, but at least he's in my house and I can keep an eye on him and what he's doing. Better than to kick him out and put him on the street and winds up on drugs or whatever." Thank God I never got on drugs. I was on other things, but not drugs. All right? The parents remain committed to them. The adopted child benefits from the stability of the parents' faithfulness to the family covenant. And so the adopted child will learn from the parents' faithfulness. And the already existent obedient natural children, not just the rebellious estranged children. They would learn to love the estranged children just as the rest of the family does in hope for their return and reconciliation. That's the parable of the prodigal son. He took off. The father never stopped looking for him. God has never stopped wanting the Jewish people. He's never stopped desiring Israel, the Jewish people. Okay? So what do we see? We see that faith brings you into God's already existing family. Humility and gratitude are brought into a household that God has already established. We learn humility and gratitude in the house that he's already established. And you share his heart for the rest of the family, even those who are presently wounded or not yet recognizing their Messiah. So discipleship is like this. It's learning to live faithfully inside the family home. It's learning to live faithfully in the family home. That's why you see me sometimes pulling the tensions between the church and the Jewish world. Why? Because that's God's heart. That's why you see me, or you hear me always talking about God's heart for the church and God's heart for Israel. Because we're the middleman here. We're Messianic Jews and the Gentiles who come along, they recognize the value of Israel. And you're recognizing that, hey, you know what? This whole thing is going to culminate there, not in Washington, D.C. Yeshua's coming back, not George Washington. God rest his soul. He did a lot for our nation. He was a called man of God. All right? So discipleship's learning to live faithfully inside the family home, honoring the covenant and caring about the whole family, not just your own place in it. There's an affront to selfishness and self-centeredness there. Go to Romans 11:17. He says, we just read it. He says, if some of the branches were broken off, if some of the branches were broken off, okay, that's the pattern of what most English translations say. However, if we go back to that time period and look at Greek documents and how the word there for broken off is used, it does not mean to be completely broken off. It means, let me give you a description from an ancient Greek writer. He describes a situation in which a wrestler's toe was dislocated during a match. Does it sound like being completely severed? No. Dislocated means it can be put back in place. It doesn't mean completely severed. Even if you go to the early Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, the word here that's used for broken off is used in place of the same Hebrew equivalent in Leviticus 1:17 that refers to a pigeon or a dove used for the burnt offering, and it says, he shall split it at its wings, but shall not divide it completely. In other words, it's not completely torn. It's in an injured state, but it's not completely torn. What many in church history, and I'm not here to spread an offense that wasn't given to me or to you because we didn't live in that time. Okay, I'm just telling you what happened. And it's not to hold an offense with the Catholics down the street or anybody else, all right? Because everybody has their problems. Nobody has a clean history. Anybody here have a clean history? No? Maybe if you're like 1 day old. If you're 1 day old, you're upset and you're crying for food and messing everything up. Nobody has a clean history. This is what I always tell everybody everywhere I go. You know, whether it's a church or whether it's a Jewish environment, no one has a clean history. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All right? Okay, so it means dislocated, not a complete tearing off. It could mean bent. All right? They're still attached. These branches are still attached, but they're in an injured situation. All right? They have been purposely injured. If one were to view the branches as bent, then the inconsistency with the earlier stumbled but not fallen is lessened. In other words, God intentionally has surgically injured them, not brutally abused the Jewish people. Okay? You're saying, well, where's the hope in this? And that still doesn't say. I'm getting to that. Rega. All right? So the imagery of being bent or injured and not broken off aligns more closely with the harvesting imagery of the olive tree, where one would expect branches to be bent in the process, but not intentionally broken off. Another argument that supports the claim that the branches were only dislocated and not removed is found in the actual manner in which ancient olive tree grafting was practiced. It was not practiced by breaking off a branch and adding a new branch in its place. Rather, it was accomplished by segmenting the existing branch and setting the new one into it. Okay? So God was willing to dislocate branches that were native to the tree. How much more? How much more? Now, this is where we get to the fear of the Lord. If God was willing to dislocate natural branches that were native to the tree, how much more will he cut off those foreign branches who were engrafted from a foreign tree? Right? And then he says, so he's basically saying this, based on this, those from the nations who are not Jews should not be arrogant. Because it's easier. It's easier to reattach the native branches of the tree that have been cut off than it is to graft foreign branches on. Now, when we look in verse 22, Continue in his goodness, otherwise you will be cut off. All right? That verb there insinuates a complete cutting off. In other words, he's telling the foreign branches, just like I just said, they were dislocated. They weren't completely broken off. In English, in the English translations, you don't really get the dynamics of this. Okay? He's saying the natural branches have been dislocated. They haven't been completely broken off. But if you boast, and if you, as being a foreign wild branch, boast against the natural branches, you will be completely cut off. And it's much more severe there. All right? So that's where the fear of the Lord comes in. All right? And that verb there is used, again, going back to the Septuagint, it's used to translate the very word that's used in relation to the covenant that God gives when he says, if anyone does this, they will be cut off from his people. Speaking about being cut away from the covenant. In other words, it's a complete excision, a complete removal. All right? And let me put it to you like this, because I know I'm getting kind of technical here, and some of you might be sweating and be like, oh, man, I don't want to be cut off. And you ever had those moments? It's like religious OCD. You begin to feel very bad. Anytime someone reads something bad in Scripture, it's like, oh, man, that must be me. Oh. Anytime someone talks about demon possession, oh, I must have a demon. Anytime someone talks, well, I hope I didn't commit that sin. You know, I remember listening to a preacher one time, and he was talking about stealing. I'm like, man, have I stolen anything? I remember John Ramirez. He used to be a Satanist over in Nyack, and he's got a larger global ministry. And he was saying he used to go to David Wilkerson in Times Square Church, and he said, man, I remember when I got saved, I'd go up for every altar call. I didn't care what it was. He said, I wasn't even gay, but I'd go up whenever they gave an altar call for gay people. He said, that's how convicting the word was. I said, oh, man. Sometimes, like, oh, I hope I didn't do that. Okay? Let me put it to you like this. When a Gentile Christian, all right? Now, Gentile's not a bad word. It just means a person from the nations. It can be used derogatorily, but we're not using it like that. We're full of love here, all right? Okay? When a Gentile Christian stops believing in God, let me ask you a question. Let me put it like this. When a person stops believing in God, what do you call them? An atheist. When a Gentile Christian stops believing in God, they're an atheist, right? They're an unbeliever. When a Jew stops believing in God, they might be an atheist, but what do you still call them? A Jew. That's my point. That's my point. Okay? That's why you have things like circumcision, being born into the covenant. Okay? Now we have to be born again into the new covenant because it's a deeper covenant. All right? But the Gentiles who come in, but the new covenant is Israel's covenant. And the Gentiles come into that new covenant without having to become Jews. Okay? And one of the things that we deal with in the Messianic community is you have people who try to say that Gentiles have to live and do everything the same way as Jewish people do. Okay? It's called one law observance or Hebrew roots. Okay? Now, here's the problem with this. Okay? Let me tell you why this is a problem. One argument from these groups who say that all Gentiles have to live Torah the same as Jews, and Acts 15 settled this. One argument is that the grafted tree branch takes on the identity of the tree it's grafted onto, but that's not true. If you took an apple tree branch, cut it, grafted it onto an orange tree, is the apple tree branch going to produce oranges? No, it's going to produce apples. All it's doing on the orange tree is it's taking the life from the root system, from the nutrients that are going from the orange tree, and it's going to produce a fruit that makes it to thrive and become more productive. In the original intent that the gardener has intended. Okay? Well, what about Ruth? In that time before Yeshua came, as a Gentile, you had to completely become a Jew. You had to, because of the prevalent idolatry. But wild olives being grafted on the natural olives will remain distinct. Okay? Well, there's neither Jew nor Greek nor male or female. That's right. For getting into the covenant. But thank God, last I checked, I'm still a guy, and my wife's still a woman. Okay? What happens when the wild olive branch that hasn't been cultivated gets grafted onto the natural cultivated branch? It receives what? It receives the life and a new hope for life. That's the good news. Well, you got all this bad news, and I'm foreign to the tree, and I'm a Gentile, and you're not making me feel too good. Oh yeah, you can now receive hope for a new life. It doesn't mean the branch lives independently. It's dependent on the tree and the root system, even if it doesn't share the same origin and cultivated identity. There's hope in Messiah. When you're grafted in as a Gentile, you are severed from the old root, the old life system, the old world system that you were once supported and thriving in. All right? I had somebody text me the other day. It's a guy I've known, I think a little over 20 years. And he asked me a question. And I said, you've been learning this stuff almost as long as I have. How is it that you still don't know it? How is it you still don't get it? And let me tell you why this would be an argument. That people would say, well, Gentiles have to do everything the same way as Jews. Let me tell you why. Because people don't understand grafting. Okay? It's because they don't understand the identity received when you become placed in Messiah's family. They apply this is what happens. What God, we just read it earlier. God said, "Don't make a graven image unto me." In other words, don't have a misperception of me and then turn that into something concrete that everybody has to bow down to. Holy Spirit, help me. Lord, break bondages of lies. Okay? What will happen is people will apply their misperception of their identity in Messiah as an outgrowth of a misperception of Yeshua himself. What people will do is they will apply the misperception of their identity in Jesus because that is an outgrowth of their misperception of Jesus himself. And this is where their understanding of Yeshua is that he's out to turn everyone into a copy of each other. But conformity to him is not copying you or you. Okay? Have you ever met two twins? They can be as different as day and night, even though they look exactly the same. Okay? The grafted wild branch takes on the life, not the identity of the tree. This is why people who see the God of, this is why people get saved, or that's why some of you who've been here for 30, 40 years, I don't know however long, 100 years, whatever, we probably got people buried under here at some point before, before it was Beth Messiah. This is why people who hate religion, they see God as abusive instead of an Abba. Is because they see the God of Israel as an abusive father instead of an Abba. And this is why people wind up in deep forms of religiosity without any power that actually sets them free or transforms their lives. Your life should be transformed because of this kind of news. Okay? The body of Messiah, supported by the root of Israel's Messiah, grafted into the Jewish remnant of cultivated natural branches. Who is that Jewish remnant? It was the apostles. He says, we're built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Those who among the Jewish people were faithfully following the God of Israel. Even though the nation sometimes murdered them and killed them. All right? What Paul does is he creates a light and heavy argument that if God's willing to injure branches he cultivated to bring in wild branches, how much more willing will he be to completely cut off wild branches in order to restore injured branches to cultivate them once again? You might be saying, well, how is that good news? Here is how it's good news. Because the final word is God's restoration and it's God's mercy. It's restoration. Just read Romans 9 through 11. Has God cast off his people? Certainly not. And here's the thing, if God, he even said it already in Jeremiah 31. He said, listen, if the sun stops shining, if the moon and stars stop giving their light, so also will I cast off the seed of Israel forever. People talk about the lost tribes. They were never lost. If they were lost, it means God has Alzheimer's. Well, where did I put little Yaakov at? Where's he at? I don't remember where did I put Shlomi and Haran? Where'd they go? I don't know. Tucker Carlson thinks they should all take DNA tests and all these kind of nonsensical weird things. The Jewish people have always remained the Jewish people because God has a covenant and he's faithful to his covenant. I'm getting a little too excited here. I need to be a little too, okay? So listen, the grafting in of the Gentiles is a part of God's plan to restore Israel because it improves the world. It improves the nations. Not necessarily because it improves Israel. And yes, the nations will bring their riches and help restore the nation. And here's another thing, is your discipleship is not just about your personal growth, it's about your placement in God's global plan of redemption. And this is why you need to think big and globally, instead of just about yourself. Because you're a part of something bigger. How is it that a Texas cattle raiser who's a Christian, who's a strong advocate for Israel and the Jewish people, is a man who's gone down as the man who successfully produced a red heifer? Huh? Oh, but any time you have a cow born, then the Islamic world throws a fit and wants to blow them up and go and do suicide bombings and all these kinds. That was what October 7th was about. It was a reaction to a cow being born. Yeah. Because of the temple. It's like they see it as one step closer to Israel rebuilding the temple. Okay? So your discipleship isn't just about personal growth. It's about your placement in God's global plan of redemption. All right? And Israel, the Jewish people, they're currently in an injured state of being without Messiah. He says, you know what? They're in partial blindness, is what Paul says. Rav Shaul, he says they're in partial blindness. Okay? So again, I've heard many use that as a jab against the Jewish people. Oh, well, they're partially blind. Yeah, and without them, you're totally blind. The nations are totally blind without Israel's Messiah. They're partially blind. You have no eyesight whatsoever. In complete darkness. Go ask Amazonian Indians. We had the West Papuans here several months ago. Huh? And I'm sitting down with Pastor Martin, and he says, I said, how did the nation get the gospel? He said, well, there was Dutch missionaries, and there was this prophecy that a shaman gave several centuries ago that there would be a white uncle. One of our white uncles would come and would tell us the way back to God. And the white uncle who came, this is why people are so down on colonialism and all this stuff. Well, white people came to America, and 19 million Native Americans died. Well, they were slaughtering each other way before white people got here. Go read how the Comanches were so feared more than the Aztecs even. The Aztecs were afraid of the Comanche. And when you were going to get tortured by the Comanche, the women led the torture. The grandmas did. They're in complete darkness. Israel, the Jewish people, are currently in an injured state of being without Messiah. What does this tell us? It tells us that God does not abandon us when we're injured, but we can fall into unbelief when we focus on our injury and try to fix ourselves more than Him. Imagine going to the doctor and the doctor says, you know what, you got this diagnosis. Can you hand me my phone, please? I'm going to read something here in a little bit. And you say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to have them do surgery on me. I'm going to go home and I'm going to do surgery on myself. What? You know, there was a movie about a guy stranded on Mars. And he was stranded on Mars. It's like a novel or something like that. And there was an explosion with something, and he got like shrapnel in his suit and stuck in his gut. And so he had to operate on himself. I'm like, oh yeah, that's real, yeah. You know, and he's got the mirrors, and he's looking at him, and he's going, and he's like trying not to pass out. Yeah, doing surgery on yourself is not a good idea. Okay? Well, you were a teenager, and what did mom do? Come over here. What? And she's popping your pimples and all that kind of stuff. You can't even do that well. All right? You don't have the ability to conduct surgery because you don't have the range of sight. And so Israel, at this point in time, they're waking up. Many are here who've recently had an encounter and have, that's what's happening. Why? Because the nations are going back into darkness. The nations are going back into darkness. And so you see the Jewish people the Lord is beginning to open the eyes of more Jewish people to who their Messiah is.